Hello and welcome back to the history of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran with episode 113 of season 3. First of all, thank you for all your messages and mails. I can't reply to each one of them even if I tried, but thank you for writing. If you're listening to and enjoying this podcast, I'm happy. Also, to everyone who's been asking about the book History of Bangalore, my publishers Penguin and I, we are in the final edits and we are looking at a launch date later this year. Watch the space. Okay, let's get to it. In the last episode, the events at Pune resulted in the Marathas, after months of fence-sitting, throwing in their lot with the British, and 10,000 Maratha cavalry were now placed under British command. Add to this the forces of the Nizam of Hyderabad. The Triple Alliance was in place, and now battle plans were being drawn up. The target, Bangalore. And this episode is about how Charles Cornwallis made plans for the 6th Battle of Bangalore and how the British arrived at the city's gates. But first, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support. They make this podcast possible. Building cities, one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. There is a small plaque on the curved stone masonry of the Bangalore fort. It's set less than 3 meters high off the left side of what came to be known as the Delhi Gate. A passing pedestrian would almost certainly miss it. The plaque reads, "Through this breach, the British assault was delivered, March 21st, 1791. Below the plaque today is a footpath crowded with vendors selling gourds and peanuts and Rexine jackets. The road that sidewalk serves was once the moat of the Bengaluru fort. It was covered over in later years and turned into a busy road. That one small, easy-to-miss plaque marks that exact spot where the British were able to make British India a reality. Everything that followed the siege and the breach, the cantonment, the civil station, the geography of modern Bangalore, all trace its origins back to the events that began in February 1791, when Charles Cornwallis marched out of Fort St. George in Madras and headed to invade Bangalore. And now, the battle plans were drawn up. The campaign was planned. Every military campaign rests on 3 things: a mission, a strategy to accomplish the mission, and tactics to carry out the strategy. Cornwallis had all 3 worked out before he left Madras. And it is worth spending a moment on each of these things because this is not just military history. The decisions made in the planning rooms of Fort St. George in early 1791 directly produce the city that we're living in, or visiting, or driving through right now. First of all, the mission. It was clear to the British. Take Bangalore, then march on Seringapatam or Srirangapatna, Tipu's capital, and force a settlement that ended the threat of Mysore permanently. They weren't looking for a temporary peace treaty of the sort that had been signed and broken twice before, once in Madras in 1769 and again at Bangalore in 1784. They wanted a definitive reduction, a settlement that would leave Tipu in no position to threaten British interests in the south ever again. But why Bangalore first? Cornwallis's thinking was recorded by the military historian Fortescue, and it was precise on this one point. Bangalore was the strongest fortress in all of the kingdom of Mysore, heavily fortified, well garrisoned, and sitting at the strategic hinge between the Carnatic plains to the east and the Mysore interior to the west. Bangalore was the plateau's gatekeeper. Take it, and it became, as Fortescue wrote, the most perfect advance base from which to reach the final objective of Seringapatam. Cornwallis's decision, though, to take Bangalore first was not original. A century earlier, Chikkadevaraju Vadayar had intended it to be this way, for Bangalore to be the first line of defense for Srirangapatna. And to that end, Chikkadeva fortified the pete in stone and built the fort. That strategic logic hadn't changed. What Cornwallis was doing in 1791, Chikkadevaraja had wanted him to do in the late 1690s. Taking Bangalore first made sense, both for attacker and defender. And if you think about it, taking the strongest fort in Mysore sent a message that General Meadows' scattered campaign of 1790 had conspicuously failed to send, that this British force had momentum and it intended to keep it. There was something else driving Cornwallis. His humiliation at the hands of George Washington in Yorktown when he had lost Virginia a decade earlier, surrounded, cut off, forced to surrender, and finally forced to surrender through a subordinate because he couldn't face the humiliation himself. Cornwallis was not going to let that happen again. If you haven't already, do listen to that episode called The Resurrection of Cornwallis, a couple of episodes earlier. Anyway, Cornwallis was not going to lose again. He was locked and loaded, strong communication lines back to Fort St. George, a secure forward base at every stage, personal command from the front. Now the strategy. It was built on two principles: concentration and deception. Let's look at concentration first. Cornwallis assembled 21,000 troops, 15,000 from Madras, the rest from Bengal, from the Calcutta Presidency. The troops assembled at Vellore, which was a fortified town about 200 kilometers west of Madras. This was the staging area. While the troops bivouacked, which means they set up camp, and waited through January, 67 war elephants arrived from Bengal, along with a formidable battering train under a Colonel Patrick Duff of the Bengal Artillery. 11 18-pounders, 6 iron 12-pounders, and 8 mortars. 40,000 bullocks were assembled to move the guns, the stores, and the treasure. Camels and elephants carried the more valuable cargo. The scale was staggering. Do the math. It's worth pausing on these numbers because without a sense of the logistics, the campaign itself would not make sense. Let's talk about the bullocks. 40,000 of them, each one needing fodder and water. The bullocks could only move slowly, in convoy, across terrain that has not been designed for the passages of armies. One 18-pounder cannon, one of 11 in the train, weighs roughly 2.5 tons. Moving it requires multiple bullocks, a team of men, and ground that doesn't turn into slush. Next, the 21,000 men. Every soldier in the field requires food, ammunition, water, and equipment. Multiply one by 21,000 men, add the artillery, add the animals, add the support staff called camp followers who cook, carry, tend to the sick, manage the stores, and you begin to understand why Cornwallis was so focused on completing the campaign before the June monsoon. When the monsoon arrived, the plateau roads would become impassable. The bullocks would flounder. The cannons would sink in the mud. The campaign would just stop. 4 months. That was all they had. That was the window. Here's another interesting aside. Even with such a large and unwieldy force, Cornwallis still needed to practice deception. He needed to hide this entire lumbering army train moving towards Bangalore. The deception per se was important because Tipu Sultan, anticipating the British advance, had concentrated all his defensive preparations and positions on the predictable southern entry points into the plateau, principally the Gajalhati Pass and also the central mountain passes that had been the theater of General Meadows' campaign the previous year. Tipu scouts and spies watched those routes. His forces were positioned to respond to a British advance along that expected axis. So Cornwallis gave him exactly what he expected to see and then deceived him. The British army first set out moving as though it was headed for the southern passes. Then suddenly, Cornwallis took a sharp right turn and pushed north towards the Mugali Pass. It's a narrow mountain pass in the Eastern Ghats near the rugged Chittoor district. In military terms, such a pass is called a defile because it defiles a set marching formation. And this was Tipu's strategic blind spot. This Mugali Pass was less heavily guarded, more manageable for heavy artillery, and it would put the British army onto the Mysore plateau before Tipu could organize a coherent response. Cornwallis had, in military terminology, executed a flanking maneuver. Meanwhile, on the west along the Malabar coast, the Bombay Division under General Abercrombie would push east through the Coorg Mountains, opening a third axis of pressure, and then, combined with the Maratha cavalry driving down from the north and the Nizam's forces pressing down from the northeast, Tipu would face simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Precisely the situation that Hyder Ali had always sought to avoid, and precisely the situation that had undone General Meadows when it was reversed against him, reversed against the British in the previous year. And now, Cornwallis was turning Tipu's own strategic playbook against him. And the one critical element of the strategy was time. As before, Cornwallis wanted the entire campaign, capture of Bangalore, subsequent march on Srirangapatna, all completed before the monsoons arrived in June. The monsoon would turn the plateau roads into mud. It would cut the supply lines and make artillery movement a joke, and effectively end all active operations for months. So, this was the urgency built into every decision from the moment the army left Vellore. And now for a commercial break, and when I'm back, the march begins. Tipu makes his moves right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Cornwallis marched out of Fort St. George on the 5th of February 1791. He reached Vellore on the 11th of February. By late February, the entire army was assembled, the artillery was ready, and the bullocks were loaded. And then there was a complicating factor that Cornwallis had been tracking. Tipu Sultan in the weeks before the British advance had been in Pondicherry. Tipu was dealing with matters related to the Franco-Mysore relationship. When word reached him that Cornwallis had left Madras and was marching, Tipu rushed back to Bangalore, intending to intercept the British forces en route, engage it before it could reach the plateau. This is why Cornwallis, expecting this, pulled that flanking maneuver through the Mugali Pass to get onto the plateau before Tipu could make his position felt effectively. Net result was that this deception by Cornwallis had worked. The 1st Division of the British Army reached the Mugali Pass on the 17th of February. The ascent was roughly 300 meters, less steep and treacherous than the southern passes, and Cornwallis's troops managed it. With elephants hauling the heavier equipment, the entire artillery train was moved up in good time. By the 21st of February, the entire army was encamped on the Mysore plateau without having fired a single shot. Now, the important thing to understand here is that Cornwallis had arrived on the plateau on the high ground without a battle. Typically, heavy losses would have been incurred even by this stage. The local population along the way, far from fleeing in panic, came out to sell grain and poultry to the advancing army. The Brinjaris, as they were called, and these were nomadic grain merchants who followed armies across the Deccan and had done so for centuries, dogged the column with their stocks. The mood in the British camp after that demoralizing campaign of 1790 was markedly different this time. And there was something else that lifted the mood: the countryside itself. A Scottish officer named Alexander Derome, who was on that march, wrote a book about the 1971 campaign, the one we're talking about right now. This book was published in 1793. In it, Derome discusses with undisguised wonder about the climate of the Bangalore plateau, which he noted was temperate and healthy to a degree unknown in any other tract of comparable size within the entire range of the tropics. The monsoons that deluge the Coromandel and Malabar coasts on the east and west coast respectively lose their force against the Ghats. Those mountains break the rains before they can reach the interior of the Deccan Plateau. What arrives on the plateau instead are frequent showers, sometimes heavy, but rarely prolonged, and this keeps the country green and the air cool almost right through the year. In fact, the British Grand Army, Durham wrote, stayed in tents and never even had to go into cantonments for the entire duration of the 1791 war. For all the soldiers who had marched through the punishing heat of the Carnatic plains, the plateau felt like a different world entirely, exactly the same way that we feel today about living in Bangalore, the famous Bangalore weather. On the 24th of February, the British Army began its final push towards Bangalore, marching in 3 columns, infantry in the middle, artillery on the right, cavalry on the left. Their route took them through Chittoor and Palamner and right onto the plateau. The early stages were fairly rapid. On the 28th of February 1791, Kolar fell to the British. 2 days later, on the 2nd of March, Hoskote Fort was taken by the 13th Bengal Battalion with little more than a show of force. But Tipu Sultan was not Hyder Ali's son for nothing. He employed a much-tested battle tactic using people called the lutis. Lutis were expert horsemen, irregulars, which means not part of the standing army. The lutis would harass the slow-moving enemy with fast guerrilla attacks on their flank, cause chaos in the formations, destroy valuable stores and supplies, make off with elephants, horses, and camels. And this is what the lutis did to the British forces marching upon Bangalore. And on this particular march, there was also something else that helped not only the lutis but the entire Mysore army: very thick fog. This was the kind of fog that reduces visibility to a few meters and made it impossible for the British coalition forces to see what was moving alongside them. And what was moving alongside the British columns was Tipu's army. Tipu had matched Cornwallis' pace, marching his forces in parallel, invisible in the fog, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one day, almost like a scene from a movie, on the 5th of March, late one morning, the fog suddenly lifted and the two armies found themselves face to face, staring at each other across a stretch of ground, totally unprepared. The reason the two armies did not immediately fall upon each other and fight was because that stretch of ground between them was marshy and it made immediate engagement impractical. Commanders from both the armies assessed the situation, assessed the risk, and decided to hold back. The moment passed without a battle. But there they were, all assembled, exposed, and there was no more deception possible. The following morning, the 6th of March, Tipu moved. His cavalry struck a British detachment under Colonel Stevenson, catching it exposed, bypassing the baggage and sending Mysore's forces charging in multiple directions all at once. The British cavalry tried to pursue, but it was stopped cold because of heavy volleys of musketry and rockets from the Mysore troops, who had somehow managed to rally themselves onto higher ground. In the melee, Colonel Floyd, one of Cornwallis' senior cavalry commanders, was shot in the face and fell from his horse. He was left momentarily on the ground before a Corporal Murray dismounted and assessed that the wound was not mortal, and then he rode back hard to bring back a rescue party. So Floyd survived. But British losses in the engagement were heavy, over 200 men and nearly 300 horses. Horses were very difficult to replace mid-campaign, and that loss was felt acutely. Now there would be no more waiting. The Battle of Bangalore had to begin. The very next morning, the 7th of March 1791, Cornwallis ordered the storm of Bangalore. And this is the moment when all military planning meets the geography of the battle, where the rubber meets the road. Tipu had made a calculation about Bangalore's defense that would prove to be a critical error. Tipu himself was not inside the fort when the British arrived. He had left the fort under the command of his Kiledar, a fort's commandant, a man named Bahadur Khan. Inside the fort, under Bahadur Khan's command, were 8,000 troops. In the Bengaluru Pete, adjacent to the fort, an additional 2,000 infantry, and 5,000 others held defensive positions. Tipu himself moved to Kengeri, that's about 20 kilometers southwest of Bangalore, from where he planned to conduct sustained harassment of the British siege while the fort held out. Tipu's reasoning was sound, but only up to a point. The Bangalore fort had never been breached in its history. The walls were thick, mud and stone heavily reinforced. A prolonged siege would drain British supplies. It would strain their artillery and exhaust their bullocks. Tipu could harass the supply lines with his lutis, prolong the British presence on the plateau, and simply wait for exhaustion and logistics to do what his army need not do in open battle. He had used this strategy before, so had Hyder, and it had worked before. But this time around, what Tipu may not have fully accounted for was the relatively new capability in the British army, the sappers. Called the Corps of Engineers and Pioneers, they were specialists in siege warfare. Their name comes from the French word sap, which means a covered trench. It's the same root as the English word spade. These men dug the approach trenches. These were called parallels. That allowed heavy artillery to be moved progressively closer and closer to the fort walls without exposing the gun crews to defensive fire from the ramparts. The sappers calculated the precise weak points in the fortification's geometry. Using science, they worked within yards of the defenders under fire at night, clearing ditches and fixing scaling ladders for the assault to come. In all previous sieges in India, the British, indeed everybody before them, had relied on brute artillery force, using cannons to repeatedly pound the gates and the walls of a fort till they gave. The sappers brought something much more methodical and much more dangerous to a fixed fort. The Bangalore fort was strong, yes, but it was about to meet a force that it had never faced before. These were called the Madras Sappers. In the next episode, I will talk about the 6th Battle of Bangalore, where I follow the siege day for day, and that episode is coming up next. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.